Greetings to my friends and colleagues at the Department of Quran and Related Sciences, Darul Huda Islamic University. This is Michael Lodahl coming to you from San Diego, California, quite possibly late. I apologize for my timing issues. I know that I missed the originally scheduled event for last July. I don't know how that happened, but my apologies. I certainly would not want my problems with scheduling to indicate any lack of interest, because certainly I'm delighted and honored to engage with you all, and actually hope this can become the beginning of a very productive relationship. So thank you again. It's been, my goodness, I think over a decade now since my book, Claiming Abraham, Reading the Bible and the Quran Side by Side, was published. And I have done some articles since then, and certainly continue to sustain interest in engaging with the Quran and Islamic religious thought. I do so very intentionally as a Christian minister and theologian whose training has not been in Islamic studies, and I freely acknowledge this. I actually want to be very clear about my amateur status and my desire to continue to learn. And so, again, I appreciate this opportunity. I want to share with you just a little bit from the the introduction to Claiming Abraham, as a way to begin to talk about my interests and where I hope to continue in this journey. I'm a Christian minister and theologian pursuing my vocation primarily as a university professor, although I often have opportunities for preaching in churches and teaching adult education courses and sessions, including some, not a lot, but including some in Islam and the Quran. One of my interests through the years has involved the challenging task of attempting to understand and then to communicate to my students something of the riches of religious traditions other than my own, and other than usually my audiences. It is a difficult undertaking, this attempt to engage, to appreciate, and even particularly, especially to learn from the religious other, or to employ the biblical term, the stranger. And I found this to be a very important biblical category, the term stranger. It can also be translated as alien, but stranger seems to be a good approach. Most of us have heard the injunction of the book of Leviticus to love your neighbor as yourself. But far fewer of us know that later in the very same chapter of Leviticus, chapter 19, the Israelites were commanded also to love the alien as yourself, love the stranger as yourself. The command to love your neighbor as yourself is picked up in the Christian New Testament, I think, quoted about a half a dozen times, many of them, of course, in the Gospels. But never in the New Testament is the quotation, or is the commandment to love the stranger as yourself ever quoted. It's not there as far as we know. It's certainly not in any of Jesus' teachings that we have in the Gospels. I'm not saying that he would discourage a love for the stranger. In fact, I think his very well-known parable of the Good Samaritan makes it clear that he would have great appreciation for the commandment to love the stranger as yourself. Much of what I undertake is to use that category of stranger and argue that would include certainly the religious stranger. And I don't mean to say automatically then that anybody who doesn't think like me is a stranger, but that we should acknowledge that there are real differences in our traditions, and that we'll say from the perspective of Christian tradition, much of Islamic teaching is strange, at least in the sense of being different from, and often challenging to Christian tradition. Of course, the same could be said from the perspective of Islam. It seems important as well to add that this commandment to love the stranger as oneself is followed by this rationale. For you, yourselves, you Israelites, were yourselves strangers in the land of Egypt. It is as though God called to the fledgling community of Israel, and I believe calls to us today, to remember what it is like to be on the outside, to be the excluded or the forgotten one. This, by the way, is a value that is profoundly underappreciated in contemporary North American context, particularly the United States of America, where we are suffering from high degrees of xenophobia or fear of the stranger. Remember what it feels like, though, and thus to know that the alien or the stranger is also a fellow human being, and thus one who can feel the pain of exclusion, of marginalization, of dehumanization. And I believe that there is plenty within the Islamic tradition as well to undergird and to support this kind of sentiment. In my best moments, I've tried to nurture in my own heart and my own thinking, as well as in the hearts and minds of my students, even a glimmer of what it might mean for us to love the religious strangers, that is, people of religious convictions and practices that might appear alien to us, to love them as our very selves. And that continues to be my deepest motivation, I think, in engaging, I would say, both with Islamic tradition as well as Jewish, and to a lesser degree, the more typically Far Eastern traditions, Eastern Asian traditions. So I am still in the process of being a student of Islam, and with plenty to learn, for sure. I'm still working particularly in the area of themes and characters, we might say biblical characters, or characters that are shared both by the Jewish and Christian Bibles and by Islam. Even though I am neither a scholar of the Quran nor actually trained as a scholar of the Bible. My education is in theology, and theology can vary in terms of its direct engagement with Scripture. There are certainly many theologians who are guided more, I would say, by philosophical concerns than scriptural ones. I'm not offering any judgment of such folks at all. I think there's room for plenty of different approaches to theological discourse. I have tried to be a student of Scripture and of biblical scholars, while, again, my primary vocation is more strictly theological. I do understand that regardless of whether one calls oneself a biblical scholar or a theologian or even a philosopher of religion, that we are all involved in the reading of texts. And the reading of texts inevitably necessitates the interpretation of texts. And I am a huge fan of the discipline, the phenomenon of interpretation, and particularly interpretation as it occurs within a community. What Josiah Royce, a prominent American philosopher about 100 years ago, love to call a community of interpretation. And I believe, of course, that Islam itself has spawned many communities of interpretation, as have, of course, any other religious tradition. And I'm deeply interested in that process and the prospects of the interpretive act, particularly as it is a social act. In my book, Claiming Abraham, I attempted to read the texts of the Bible and the Quran precisely, I would say, as a theologian, which means constantly or consistently asking about the theological assumptions, whether those assumptions are explicit or implicit, that arise from engaging with the text. Similarly, in asking such questions of the text, whether biblical or Quranic, we are confronted by the inescapable fact that we readers approach the text already and always with our own and often unexamined theological assumptions. I find this, of course, to be the case certainly with the reading of Scripture, of the Bible, I should say, but also of the Quran. To the extent that we acknowledge our often unexamined theological assumptions, perhaps we may at least occasionally allow our assumptions and prior commitments themselves to be challenged, chastened, or even changed. Our primary goal, or my primary goal in that book, Claiming Abraham, was to interpret and reflect upon what the text either implies or directly claims about God and God's relationship to the world. To engage in such interpretation is also to wonder about the practical implications these theological claims have for the way that we live. In many ways, the work I undertook in Claiming Abraham was an extension, a part two, perhaps, of an earlier book that engaged really just the Bible in this regard, a book called The Story of God, a narrative theology. And again, the point in that book was to engage especially the narratives, that is, whether they be parables of Jesus or stories about Jesus or stories in the Old Testament, and much of the book had to do with the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament. But to ask, how is God rendered in this story? I'm much less concerned about the sheer historicity or facticity of any given story, particularly in the Old Testament. I don't doubt that there are historical elements, but I think there's also, with any historical rendition, there's always a heavy interpretive element. The human being as interpreter of events is inescapable. And I think it's important to see that in the Bible. I do understand, and I think I'm correct to say that generally, I can't speak for any of you, of course, generally Quranic scholarship has probably been more hesitant to take this approach, which I would call a sort of narrative, historical, critical approach to the text. And of course, I do so in Claiming Abraham, also with the Quran. I do take that approach. I will mention to you all that as I wrote Claiming Abraham, and I knew as I was, my goal was to approach it certainly respectfully, but quite aware that I was making assumptions about the Quranic text that would not be shared by the great majority, the vast majority of Quranic scholars, certainly by those who were identified themselves as traditional Muslims, because I did not approach the text with the assumption that it was direct recitation, divine recitation, even mediated through Gabriel or anything along that line. That does not mean I don't believe that one might, even as a Christian, consider the possibilities of the Quran having revelatory significance. But there's a difference between, I think, revelatory significance and the idea of direct divine recitation. And of course, this is a conversation that goes on within Christianity as well. We certainly have Christians who look at the Bible as kind of a direct divine recitation. We generally call them fundamentalists, or certainly very conservative in their approach to the Bible. I'm much more willing to understand it within its historical, social context, and with always with a human element. If you've looked at Claiming Abraham, or perhaps read it, you'll know that my argument is that Christianity actually is ideally, at least, much more friendly and open to what I would call the human element. That our understanding of God is deeply covenantal and incarnational. That God indeed is pleased to dwell in our midst and to work through our own human efforts. Obviously, much more could be said about that. It can be nuanced a great deal more, but that is one of the differences that, for me, as and admittedly as a Christian, as I engage the Quranic text, this is a difference that for me arose consistently. Within the book, I talk about the story of Abraham and the destruction of the children of Lot, or the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the differences between the Genesis text, the Genesis rendering of that story, and what we find in the Quran. I do the same with Adam naming the creatures, which is also in the book of Genesis, and very differently told, of course, in the Quran. Those would be two examples, I think very dramatic examples, where the Bible seems to give much more room to the human element in, we'll say, dialogue with and cooperation with God. I am certainly open to correction on any of those claims, and would invite your participation and response to that. Let me talk a little bit about some directions that I hope to take in the foreseeable future regarding my engagement with the Quran and Islamic tradition as a Christian theologian. Some of the themes that I continue to be intrigued by include religious diversity. That is the sheer fact that our world is inhabited by many different religious traditions. And I'm intrigued by the way the Quran addresses that diversity. I want to learn further from Islamic developments on that question. I've done some exploratory papers in that regard and given some presentations in England at the Center for the Study of Christianity and Islam at Nazarene Theological College, associated with the University of Manchester. But I anticipate doing further work in that regard. I've actually also tried to write a little bit in my most recent book, which is about the Gospel of Matthew, but talked about this same issue. So religious diversity is one of those things. I've also done some additional work beyond Claiming Abraham on the really fascinating theology of signs in the Quran. You know, the ayat that are evident throughout creation for those who are careful to observe, for those who are attentive. This is a very interesting theology, and I tell many different audiences when I talk about this theme that while the Bible does include that idea, it's actually not very widespread in the Bible at all. There's, one particular passage in the Psalms, in Psalm 19, that would come closest to a Quranic theology of signs, but that's just one psalm. And then there is a passage in Paul's letter to the Romans in the New Testament that also, would be the closest thing. But really, these are just two passages in the entire Bible, and really very little of this theology of signs throughout creation. Indeed, I would argue that generally in the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, God's revelatory voice is far less in signs in creation, and I can look out and actually see the lovely Pacific Ocean out my window, and I know that in the Quran there's one of the signs is the waters, and even the ships that sail in those waters. But in the Bible, it's far more in events in history, and of course that's, I think, included in the Quran as well. But the Bible doesn't really say nearly as much about the created order, about the world of nature, as an avenue of divine revelation. Now, Christian theology has developed this idea, for sure. We even have a category for it. We call it natural theology. But its biblical warrants or biblical support actually are quite scant. There's just not that much. But I would like to examine that a little bit further. I've done a bit in an essay in a book called, I don't have it here at home now, but it's a book on edited by Ira Glaser. She's one of the editors, Glaser, and it's about reading the Bible within a Muslim context, and perhaps you all are familiar with this book already. I think that in a related way, because in the same essay, one of the things that I think we all together, Muslims and Christians, can and should engage is we'll say the question of sin. In Romans, where Paul talks about how people knew God through the things that God had made. I mean, it's the clearest kind of statement that corresponds to the Quranic theology of signs. But Paul goes on to say that though they knew God, they did not honor God, and nor did they give God thanks for all the different, visible blessings, but instead fixated on these goods or blessings themselves, and thus basically fell into idolatry. And while I want to be careful about this, I've been cautioned by a Muslim scholar at Oxford who for whom I have great respect. I don't know that I want simply to identify shirk with idolatry, but it seems that there's an overlap there of some kind. But Paul in Romans then says that sort of the fundamental problem with human existence as creatures who are created for God and created to acknowledge God and give God thanks is that instead we have become idolaters. We have focused our energies on the created goods around us rather than allowing those created goods to be a pointer, to be a sign of the Creator. In my own Christian tradition, within Christianity, I work in what we call the Methodist or Wesleyan tradition, and John Wesley wrote it this way, in a way that really many Christians have said something similar. But Wesley counseled his readers to love the creature as the creature leads to the Creator. So there's something about addressing or relating to the creature, whether it's another human being, or the food that we eat, or the beauties of the world that we see around us. And the Quran is actually much more detailed about that than the Bible ever is. In fact, in this one essay, I suggested that the Apostle Paul would have appreciated, I think, some of the very almost luscious language of the Quran in celebrating the goodness of these signs of the Creator in the world around us. So I do think that this is another area of possible collaboration. I want to add on to that, especially because there seems to be within Islamic tradition the idea that Christianity's doctrine of original sin is very problematic from a Muslim perspective. And I actually think this is also an area where we could hone in a little bit more and discuss. The doctrine of original sin doesn't necessarily have to carry all the baggage that many Christians attach to it. And I think that often Islamic response or reaction has been to some of that baggage. But the doctrine of original sin at its heart is really about the horrible mystery that human beings seem so easily and readily prone to idolatry, to worshiping and serving the creature rather than the Creator. And it seems to me that the Quran itself also shows great, like the mystery of how it is that these human creatures created out of, a drop of fluid, created by God and raised up to be responsible agents, how it is that we could be so thick-headed and so rebellious and so ready not to pay attention to the signs within creation around us. And I honestly do think that in conversation with one another, it's quite possible that Christians and Muslims could collaborate on a more helpful, mutually helpful and fruitful understanding of the problem of sin and of human disobedience within the world. This is certainly an area that I hope to explore further. I know my time is just about up, and I appreciate the time you've given me. I even as I talk about these areas of collaboration, I'm also very aware that there are texts in the Quran that present profound challenges to Christian teaching, particularly about Jesus and the doctrine of God as triune. I'm never one to shy away from those differences. I'm a big fan of acknowledging and even celebrating difference, and it would be no different in the case of Christology or the doctrine of Christ and the doctrine of the Trinity. I do think, though, that even here there are traditions both in Islam and in Christianity that have made it more difficult for us to read our respective texts, let alone the texts of the other tradition, in ways that might allow those texts to speak in new ways to us. But I think this is for another time, perhaps, to explore further. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you, and pray great and deep blessings upon you all as we enter into the year of 2022. And may we all see if nothing else, a receding of this COVID threat that has been such a difficult aspect of our lives the past couple of years. Thank you again, and many blessings to you.